Welcome back to Anatomiqa. In the previous session, we discussed on the second type of muscle, the cardiac muscle. To recap, the gross features, location, arrangement of fibers, and nerve supply of cardiac muscle was discussed. Striated muscles are cross-striated in appearance under the microscope, supplied by cerebrospinal nerves, and are usually controlled voluntarily. Hence, they are termed voluntary muscles. But the muscles of the pharynx and the diaphragm are striped in structure, but their actions are not strictly under voluntary control, but are involuntary. Striped muscles are also called the skeletal or somatic muscles due to their attachments to skeletal tissue. These muscles contract with great rapidity but are fatigued more easily. Voluntary muscles serve to adjust the body with its external environment. Voluntary muscles form about 42% of the total body weight. They act on joints producing movements. Only 20% of the energy set free during movements is expressed as work and the remainder is utilized to produce heat. When the body temperature falls below normal, an attempt is made to generate more heat in the rapid muscular contraction, which is known as shivering. Let us understand the terms used for describing voluntary muscles. To begin with attachments, origin and insertion. Origin is the end, usually at the proximal part of a muscle, which is relatively fixed during its contraction. And insertion is the end at the distal part of the muscle. Each end of a muscle is attached by connective tissue to a bone or cartilage or to any other structure. When a muscle contracts, usually one of its ends remains fixed and the other end moves. By convention, the fixed end is called the origin and the movable one the insertion. In a limb, the distal attachment of the muscle is usually called the insertion because the distal parts are more movable. However, too much stress should not be given to origins and insertions since anatomical insertion in some muscle remains fixed and the origin moves. The two terms, origin and insertion, are sometimes interchangeable when the origin moves and the insertion is fixed. There are three types of insertion of muscles. Some muscles are inserted near the proximal end of a bone close to a joint. This increases the range of movement, but the power of action is less. Example, biceps brachii and psoas major. Sometimes a muscle is inserted at the middle of the shaft of the bone. Example, coracobrachialis and pronator teres. Some are inserted towards the distal end of bone away from the joint. Here, the power of action is more but range of movement is less. Example, brachioradialis. Belly is the fleshy and contractile part of a muscle, highly vascular with higher metabolic rate and cannot withstand pressure or friction. Fibrous part is the non-contractile and non-elastic part of the muscle, less vascular and is resistant to friction. Depending on the shape, it is given different names. If the fibrous part of a muscle is cord-like, it is called tendon. If the fibrous part is flattened and is attached to the muscle, it is called aponeurosis. Raphe is a fibrous band made of interdigitating fibers of the tendons, or aponeurosis, which is stretchable. Let us see what are the functions of a tendon. It concentrates the muscle pull at the sites of insertion. It is immensely powerful so that a tendon whose cross-sectional area is 1 square inch can support a weight of 9,700 to 18,000 pounds. The fibers of a tendon are twisted or plated so that the muscle pull is distributed to all points at the site of insertion. When a tendon is subjected to sudden and accidental traction at the insertional end, the bone may be fractured without the rupture of the tendon. This shows tremendous latent power in a tendon. At the myotendinous junction, muscle fibers are contiguous but not continuous with the tendon fibers. The connective tissue framework of a muscle, the endomysium and perimysium, is continuous with the similar framework of the tendon. The arrangement of muscles at the myotendinous junction resembles the dovetail appearance. Coming to the classification of muscle fibers, it is classified based on different factors like color, direction, and actions of muscle fibers. Based on the color, it is classified into red and white fibers. Let us check what are red and white muscles and simultaneously discuss the differences between the two. Red muscles are also called type 1 muscles. White muscles are called type 2 muscles fibers. Red muscle is more primitive, presents less cross striations and more sarcoplasm. Fibers are narrow in size. White fibers are more recent, presents more striations and less sarcoplasm. Fibers are broader here. In red muscles, contraction is slow but more sustained. They are highly resistant to fatigue. In white muscles, contraction is rapid but less sustained. Fatigue develops early. Red muscles contain high concentrations of mitochondria and enzymes associated with oxidative metabolism. A dense capillary network surrounds each muscle fiber. Hence, red fibers are called the oxidative fibers. White muscle possesses abundant sarcoplasmic reticulum and T system of tubules, high levels of glycogen and glycolytic enzymes, and few mitochondria. A poor capillary network surrounds each fiber. Their rapid fatigability is associated with their anaerobic metabolism. Therefore, white fibers are called glycolytic fibers. The red fibers are normally utilized for dexterous movements requiring large numbers of small motor units and for postural stance requiring sustained contractions. The white fibers contract in response to sudden and transient demands requiring extra activity and fast movement. The red fibers are found in deep muscles and deeper parts of superficial muscles. The white fibers are found in superficial muscles. The anti-gravity muscles of the trunk and the one joint brachialis and soleus muscles are examples of red muscles. Two-phasic, two-joint biceps brachii, hamstring and gastrocnemius muscles are examples of white muscles. Myohemoglobin is more abundant in red muscle. Myohemoglobin is less in white muscle. The second classification is according to the direction of the muscle fibers or fascicular architecture. The arrangement of muscle fibers varies according to the direction, force, and range of habitual movement at a particular joint. The force of movement is directly proportional to the number and size of muscle fibers, and the range of movement is proportional to the length of fibers. The muscles may be subclassified into parallel, oblique, spiral, and cruciate in type. To start with, parallel muscles. The muscle fibers are parallel to the line of pull. The fibers are long, but their numbers are relatively few. The functions of parallel muscle fibers are: the range of movement is more in this type of muscles due to increased length of fibers. The total force of contraction is less because of less number of fibers. Parallel muscles may be subdivided into the following types. Strap muscle. The fibers are flattened and long, similar to that of belt or strap. Example, sartorius and rectus abdominis. Quadratus muscle is a flat muscle, quadrilateral in shape. Example, quadratus lumborum. Fusiform muscle is bulged in the center and narrowed at the end. Example, biceps brachii. In oblique muscle, the fasciculi are oblique to the line of pull. The muscle may be triangular or pinnate, which is feather-like in construction. This arrangement makes the muscle more powerful, although the range of movement is reduced. Example for triangular muscle is temporalis. In pinnate muscle, the fibers are short and a greater number of them are accommodated. The muscle is more powerful with the range of movement reduced. Pinnate muscles present the following subtypes: unipinnate, bipinnate, multipinnate, and circumpinnate. We'll see one by one. In unipinnate muscle, all fleshy fibers slope into one side of the tendon, which is formed along one margin of the muscle. This gives the appearance of half of a feather. Examples are flexor pollicis longus, extensor digitorum longus, peroneus tertius. In bipinnate muscle, the tendon is formed in the central axis of the muscle and the muscle fibers slope into the two sides of the central tendon like a whole feather. Examples are rectus femoris, dorsal interossei of hand and foot. In multipinnate muscle, a series of bipinnates lie side by side in one plane. Example is acromial fibers of deltoid. In circumpinnate muscle, the muscle is cylindrical within which a central tendon appears. Oblique muscle fibers converge into the central tendon from all sides. Example is tibialis anterior. The functions of pinnate muscles are: the range of movement is diminished because of the shortness of muscle fibers and oblique direction of the pull. The force of muscle action is resolved into two component forces. One acts in line of pull and the other at right angle to it. The total force of contraction is increased due to greater number of muscle fibers. Coming to the spiral muscles, the third classification of voluntary muscles based on direction of muscle fibers are twisted in arrangements close to their insertion. For example, the pectoralis major is inserted to the lateral lip of bicipital groove in bilaminar U-shaped manner. The clavicular head of pectoralis major forms the anterior lamina and the sternocostal head is twisted from the lower margin of U to form the posterior lamina. Such spiral arrangements bring the proximal and distal attachments of muscle into the same plane. In supinator muscle, the spiral course imparts rotational movement to the radius. In cruciate muscles, the fourth type of classification based on direction of fibers, the fasciculi are crossed in the form of hex, hence called cruciate muscle. The masseter and the sternocleidomastoid muscles belong to this category because their muscle fibers are arranged in superficial and deep planes crossing like X. Adductor magnus is another example. According to the force of actions, two types of skeletal muscles are encountered: spurt and shunt. In a simple joint, one bone is more mobile than the other bone. A muscle, while acting on a mobile bone, exerts a force which, according to vector analysis, can be resolved into two component forces at right angles to each other. A swing component which tends to produce angular movement of the joint, and a shunt component which tends to draw the bone along the shaft towards the joint and compresses the articular surfaces. When the swing component is more powerful, where it directs the greater part of its force across the bone rather than along it, and provides the force that acts tangentially to the curve traversed by the bone, the muscle is called the spurt muscle. On the other hand, in presence of powerful shunt component, where the greater part of its force is directed along the bones, tending to pull joint surfaces together, the muscle is designated as the shunt muscle. In a spurt muscle, the proximal attachment, which is fixed attachment, is away from the joint, and the distal attachment, which is mobile attachment, lies close to the joint. Eventually, the swing component produces spurt of angular movement and The shunt component, although weak, keeps the articular surface of the bone in contact with the joint. When the angular movement exceeds 90 degrees, the shunt component acting along the shaft of the mobile bone tends to distract the bone away from the joint. The brachialis is an example of spurt muscle acting at the elbow joint. A spurt muscle provides acceleration of motion of a joint. In a shunt muscle, the proximal or fixed attachment lies close to the joint and the distal or mobile attachment lies away from the joint. Throughout the movement of shunt muscle, the compressive transarticular force keeps the articular surface of the mobile bone in contact with the joint. The brachioradialis is an example of shunt muscle acting at the elbow joint. A shunt muscle provides stabilizing centripetal force on the joint. Now, coming to the classification based on the contraction of muscle fibers under the action of voluntary or striped muscles. When a muscle contracts to produce a movement, all the muscle fibers are not necessarily brought into contraction simultaneously. On more vigorous effort, the greater number of fibers are involved, but the contraction of any individual fiber is always maximal and obeys all or none law. On contraction, the fleshy fiber of a muscle shortens by about 50 to 55% of the resting length. If the range of movement of a muscle is known, one can calculate the length of the fleshy fiber of parallel muscle. The surplus length of the muscle is converted into a tendon. A muscle cannot contract to less than a certain minimum length. This is known as active insufficiency. In passive insufficiency, a muscle cannot be stretched beyond a certain length without injury. So broadly, when a muscle contracts, it shortens by 1/3 of its belly length to bring about a movement. The range of movement depends on the length of a fleshy fibers and the power or force of movement on the number of fibers. However, the actual behavior of muscle contraction is more complex. The types under this group are isometric, isotonic, eccentric, and concentric contractions. In isometric contraction, length of the muscle remains unchanged. Example, holding the hand in outstretched position. It is the exercise without movement. There is no movement at the joint, but there is increase in the tone of muscle. On lifting a heavy suitcase, the flexor muscles contract without moving the elbow. Another example is during a biceps curl, holding the weight in a constant static position rather than actively raising or lowering it. In isotronic contraction, the length of the muscle may increase or decrease, but the tension is constant. That is, exercise with movement. When a muscle contracts, the joint angle it controls increases or decreases while the muscle either shortens or lengthens. Example, muscles shorten while holding a baby. Other examples are exercising with dumbbell, walking, running, and swimming. There are two types of isotonic contractions, concentric and eccentric. In eccentric contraction, length of muscle increase according to the functional demands of the body. The muscle lengthens as the resistance becomes greater than the force the muscle is producing. Example, when the upper limb is lowered to the side of the body. Another example is during flexion of the elbow, the triceps increases in length. Concentric contraction is when there is increasing tension in the muscle as it contracts and shortens, or in other words, the muscles shorten while generating force, overcoming resistance, or to be precise, the muscle tension rises to meet the resistance, then remains stable as the muscle shortens. Most of the contractions of muscle are concentric. For example, when lifting a heavy weight, a concentric contraction of biceps would cause the arm to bend at the elbow, lifting the weight towards the shoulder. Some important observations under actions of muscles are: total force of a muscle is the sum of the forces exerted by its individual fibers. It is directly proportional to the number of muscle fibers. Range of movement is directly proportional to the length of the muscle fibers. Power and speed of movement are related to the distance between the point of action and the axis of movement of a joint. That is, the distance between the attachments of muscle and joint. Power is more when the distance is more. On the other hand, speed is more when the distance is less. Now, to discuss the classification based on coordination of functions of muscle fibers, each movement at a joint is brought about by a coordinated activity of different muscles of groups. These muscle groups are classified and named according to their functions into prime mover or agonist, antagonist, fixator, and synergist. Prime movers or agonists bring about the desired movement. It is the chief main muscle for the particular movement or particular joint. The agonist in a movement is the muscle that provides the major force to complete the movement. Because of this, agonist is known as the prime mover. For example, brachialis is prime mover for flexion of elbow joint along with biceps brachii forming the biceps curl. When a prime mover helps opposite action by active controlled lengthening against gravity, it is known as action of paradox. For example, extending elbow joint with weight in hand is assisted by gravity but controlled by a gradual active lengthening of biceps, which is the paradoxical or eccentric action. Antagonist or opponent oppose the prime movers. They help the prime movers by active controlled relaxation so that the desired movement is smooth and precise. Thus, the antagonists cooperate rather than oppose the prime movers. This is due to reciprocal innervation of the opposite groups of muscles regulated by the spinal cord through stretch reflex. This is called law of Sherrington. For example, during the flexion of elbow joint, biceps and brachialis are acting, forming the agonists, and triceps forms the antagonist. During the extension of elbow, triceps will be acting on elbow, forming the agonist, and biceps and brachialis will be the antagonists. Fixators are the groups of muscles which stabilize the proximal joints of a limb, so that the desired movement at the distal joint may occur on a fixed base. Examples are muscles acting on shoulder joint, which are the rotator cuff muscles, are stabilized during the movement of elbow joint. Other examples are quadratus lumborum fixes the 12th rib during inspiration, facilitating contraction of diaphragm. Rhomboid muscles fix the scapula during overhead abduction. Synergist is the muscle which helps prime mover or agonist in performing stipulated actions. So it is the muscle that produces movement similar to or in concert with agonist muscle. For example, brachioradialis is the synergist which support the brachialis, the agonist in flexion of the elbow. With this, we complete the discussion on voluntary or skeletal muscle. To recall, we discussed the introduction, terms used in describing the voluntary muscle, and the classification based on color, arrangement of fibers, and action of muscles. In the next session, we will discuss the naming of muscles, blood supply, and nerve supply of the voluntary muscles.